So Jungwon Kim here is representing the Rainforest Alliance, and her work in the Rainforest Alliance has been very interesting. Many conversations we've had offline around people on the ground. We are going to be discussing feeling helpless in the face of climate change, feeling paralyzed in the face of climate change. And Ayana Elizabeth Johnson has contributed in creating the Blue New Deal and is the official representative, and is representing, you can maybe help me with that.
Yeah,
one?
so I'm a marine biologist. I am the founder of a consulting firm, Ocean Collective, as well as the think tank Urban Ocean Lab, which is focused on the future of coastal cities like New York. And I advised Senator Warren's campaign on creating the Blue New Deal plan so that the ocean is part of the discussion of climate policy.
Woo! I found my question. And Jungwon, you want to say a few words about what you do?
Yes, I work for the Rainforest Alliance, which is an international nonprofit organization that develops and implements field-based, scalable solutions to deforestation, rural poverty, and climate change. Our main focus is natural climate solutions and preventing deforestation, as well as building resilience among farming communities to the impacts of climate change.
And so climate change is a human rights issue, right? Which more often than not is being siloed. So we are either exploring one or the other, and very rarely together. And so for us here, we would like to discuss how do we see them coming together? And the question that constantly keeps on coming is, for instance, from a personal point of view, how can I have hope? Or on Instagram, we often see like, how do you have hope, you know, or how do you keep on going as a scientist, as a marine biologist, as an activist, like what keeps you going, or how can I have hope? And this idea of hope around this notion of climate needs to be explored. It's not so much about hope, right? It's not so much about having hope or losing hope. I would love for you to start, Jungwon, because oftentimes we talk together about this, and you mentioned that whenever you were on the ground working in the countries that you are sent to work in, you've never seen someone tell you, I don't have hope, or there's a lack of hope. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think first I would like to say despair is a perfectly natural response to the state of our world right now. So I don't want to shortchange what I think all of us feel from time to time, or maybe even every day. But I do think that to stay in that despair and to kind of take the attitude that, well, there's nothing I can do, it's too late, it doesn't matter. I think that position is both privileged and arrogant especially for people with intellectual and material resources. I say privilege because frontline communities, people like farmers who are, trying to plant crops when the rains are shorter or maybe even non-existent that year, forest communities who are watching their homes literally being cut down and destroyed in front of their very eyes. They have no choice but to take action every single day because their lives and their livelihoods really depend on it. And I say arrogant, I mean, I don't want to say that in a chastising way, but I think it's maybe a little bit arrogant to make the assumption that we can even know what the outcome of our efforts will be. The outcome might not be immediate. It could take a couple of generations to really see the efforts of what we are all here to do today. And I like to kind of refer to this anecdote that the very wise spiritual ecologist, Dr. Joanna Macy, once shared, which is that if you have a loved one who is in the hospital with a life-threatening illness, you don't base your decision on whether to run to their side on their chances of surviving. You just go because you love them. And, within all of the care and the attention that you give to your loved one, I think you're going to find yourself in a place of grief and uncertainty and pain. But, you know, we have to remember that grief is a measure of our love. And if we try to kind of suppress the grief that we may be feeling now, the grief about dying species or human suffering or dying ecosystems, then we're kind of cutting ourselves off from this very deep wellspring of love that we need to power and sustain our actions. And so at this point, I've really come to believe that hope is not something that we have. It's something that we do when we really live in that place where we're fully in touch with both our grief and our love.
That's a great segue to what you do in politics, for instance. Like, hope is something that we do, and again we hear that, oh, you must go and vote, and you must go and do something around changing it at scale on a systemic level. Can you comment on that, Ayana, on, as a scientist, you've been inside, outside the several institutions. How do you find hope, not personally, but for the crowd? How can they feel that hope is an action?
As a scientist, I read the science, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that it's important to acknowledge the despair, that part of coming around to doing the work and keeping going that is heartbreaking. Like, when I look at these graphs and these numbers, I see people, I see species, I see ecosystems that I love threatened. And I have found myself crying on the subway reading UN climate reports because I know what they mean for us, for our future. And it's actually more the heartache than the hope often that keeps me going. And I sometimes get annoyed when people ask me what gives you hope, and how can you give that to us, right? Because it seems unfair, because I have such a tenuous relationship with hope myself, because I know what the odds are, but that doesn't mean we get to give up. I absolutely agree that if you get to just give up and keep living your lovely life where you come to sustainable fashion conferences, that is absolutely a privilege. So there are days when I wake up and I'm like, fuck hope, but what are you gonna do, right? And so I think about hope in the context of Rebecca Solnit describes hope as the hammer you break the glass with in case of emergency. That's the kind of hope that we need, not this passive, hope someone fixes that for us, hope that works out. That is not the way that we should be using that word. And so when you talked about my engagement in policy, it reminds me that we often miss the level at which we can be most effective. People get caught up on the you need to be 100% vegan as an individual. You need to stop flying as an individual. You need to bring your own bottle as an individual. And yes, we all need to be thinking about our individual carbon footprint and the changes that we can make as an individual. And yes, we also need to be thinking about these massive systemic changes in terms of our democracy and who has power and who has access and who is shaping the future of environmental policy, and who is president. These are all things that we need to be keeping our eyes on, but there's this middle area that we all need to really be thinking about strongly, which is, where is our power? Not where are our individual actions, and not how are we changing the entire world, but where is that middle ground where you change your company, where you change your neighborhood, your church, your school, your sports team, because that's the place where we have actually the most power, and thinking not about what the things that every single person should be doing. Yes, you should all vote, but what are you actually really good at? What are your special skills, and how are you leveraging those to create the changes that we need? So I'm a marine biologist and a policy nerd. So I helped to advise this ocean climate policy plan for Elizabeth Warren, and I'm flying to Iowa in an hour to go knock on doors because I really care about the outcome of this election. And I think it's just I think that the biggest challenge right now is it's really hard for people to connect those dots from I'm one person, these problems are so big, And not everyone needs to be marching, and not everyone needs to be like stuffing envelopes, and not everyone needs to do the same thing. But like finding where you can be most useful, like take time to diagram, like do a power analysis of yourself and your network and your sphere of influence and your dollars and your vote. And think about like what are the levers that you can legitimately pull to make some really big changes.
That's an incredible segue to Jungwon. Many times we've discussed about who is at fault, because the individual, this concerned citizen, feels tremendously the weight of the climate, climate crisis. I would like to say the stats, the accusation, like you said, like have a perfect diet, have a perfect lifestyle. I really hear oftentimes the concerned citizen do feel the weight on their shoulders, but what I feel is unbalanced is how the industry doesn't feel that weight so much. It's more like, oh, I hope it works out for you guys down there. It's more like that energy instead of, what can we do as a collective of individuals, because that's what the industry is. It's a collective of people. And together we've discussed, we need everyone. We need the activists, right? Like you said that so well. We need the activists. We need the people outside with their signs. We need the people inside. But for us, in our conversation, what I felt was the most relevant for today, for this crowd, is that the biggest activists are the people working within the industry. These are the activists within that we need to be empowering. Can you comment a little bit on that, Jungwon, from your work, you've had such an incredible career, you've been an activist, you now work in, inside of an organization that's really big. Not what can we do, because that's like a question that cannot be answered right now, but at the same time, how can we empower ourselves to become an agent of change? How can we become this professional troublemaker wherever we go? Like, for instance,
I need new business cards.
Yes! Because that's the ask. Correct? Like we are kicking off the decade of action. There's literally 10 years before a total climate collapse. People are not really grasping the idea of what that means. Some communities will be affected before others. We have a lot of issues. It's a complex system. We must all become active, active agents. We have to become professional troublemaker within our industries, our given industries. And so for that, I think you have so much to give on that thought.
Well, I think the first thing I would really like to remind this group and people in the United States and this audience is that there are vibrant movements of climate activists all over the world. And through the Rainforest Alliance, I've had the incredible pleasure of getting to know highly organized farming cooperatives, for example, and meeting the board of that particular cooperative. I've had a chance to meet forest community leaders and to sit down with them and talk about their approaches, very localized and specific approaches to solving the threats that they're facing. And so I think, first of all, it's really important to remember we are not doing this in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would say the United States is kind of behind. There's so much happening in Mexico, Guatemala, Ecuador, Peru, Indonesia, Costa Rica. There are so many people.
Costa Rica was the first country to eliminate single-use plastics by law. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and to make a huge commitment to renewable
energy. And Rwanda,
energy.
I think, was the second. It's like, America, step up.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Right. So I think it's really important to remember that, we are each of us individuals. And of course, we have pundits who say, well, individual action doesn't matter. And I think I have to boldly disagree with that because, that's a kind of dualistic way of looking at how we belong to each other and to this world. The Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh, he has this quote that I come back to over and over again because I think it's so meaningful in so many different areas of life, but particularly this one, which is, he says, the wave is the ocean. And also, every drop of water is the ocean. And so if we think of ourselves as drops of water, and we kind of recognize that there are waves kind of heading in this direction all over the world, and the way that waves get bigger and bigger, you know, they start small like a sine wave. I don't know, I'm sort of digging very deep.
You could call it a ripple, maybe.
A ripple. And then the ripples eventually catch up to each other, and then they become bigger, and then they become even bigger and bigger, and eventually becomes this, you know, huge swell. And from my vantage point, I see that happening. It's happening. And so what I think is really important for this audience is for the business leaders among you and the culture changers among you to really step up and to spread awareness of the connection between, you know, poverty, deforestation, overfishing, climate change. You know, all of these things are interrelated. So first we have to do our part to educate people, and then just take as bold and big of a step as you can on your sustainability journey, wherever it is that you're starting, and keep going, and you will learn with every step that you take, you will learn what the next step should be. And then you take that, and then more people join you, and then you take that as well. We don't really have time to quibble about perfection. You know, we work with all kinds of companies because we don't, at this point, have time to be picky and choosy and say, well, we only want to work with artisanal boutique coffee roasters based in Brooklyn. No, we need to work with everyone to achieve the scale that we need at this point.
And on that, do you have a last thought? Because we have to welcome our other panelists.
I do. I mean, I think I absolutely agree with what you were saying. I think it's this moment where we need to not just think, what can I do, but what can we do? I mean, I hope that as you're here today, you find people to collaborate with and build something bigger than you can ever do alone. And I think it's also important to recognize that it's not just about having more leaders, it's about maybe just join something. We don't need 1 million new nonprofits. We don't need like 1 million new people leading nothing. Like, we all need to be joining together and merging, and that's where I think a lot of the opportunity is. So I think the most powerful thing that we can do, though, is to change culture, to change the status quo. So when we think about what we can do to contribute to that, I mean, that's the power of the people in this room. You can change what is expected. You can change what is the norm. You can exert outsized influence through that, and I think that's why I changed my schedule to be here today, is to encourage you all to use that, because policy follows culture. Legal change follows cultural change. So that's what we all need to do. If your special skill is like throwing the best parties, we actually need that for climate change, right? So thank you so much for being part of this conversation and inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I think the last thing I'll say that gives me hope is that when people talk about climate now, they talk about climate justice. When people talk about climate now, it's a 3-generation movement now, right? We have all of these people in the streets. This Earth Day, there are going to be millions of people in the streets. And so we have this inertia that's building. It's a ripple, it's a wave, it's like a tsunami of climate action. So thank you all for showing with your bodies today that this matters, that it's worth coming together and figuring out how we can all be part of that.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Jungwon. And now we are going to welcome back Jasmine Solano to introduce the next panel. Thank you.